All right, we're all set.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone, to Casca's Wandering Scots Book Club. We have a barn burner discussion today and a great round of panelists. We are looking at Sir Walter Scott's seminal work of Scottish historical fiction, Waverley, and the impact that that work has had on our perceptions of Scotland. And we are joined today by a remarkable panel of individuals, including Dr. Carolyn McCracken-Flesher next to me, who is, we couldn't have Sir Walter Scott with us today, but Carolyn is probably the next best thing because I think she knows him more intimately than anyone else on the face of the earth. We also have here in Denver, Kelly Scott Davis, the past chieftain of Clan Scott, also a man that knows intimately the world of Waverley and Sir Walter Scott and Clan Scott. We're joined from Scotland today by Fiona Armstrong, who is a dynamic journalist, a broadcaster, author, scholar, particularly expertise in Victorian Highlandism, clans and clan traditions, and she has a little bit of an extra insight into the world of clan traditions because she is joined today next to her by her husband, the McGregor, Sir Malcolm McGregor of McGregor, and as we all know that the McGregor, Clan McGregor and Clan Gregor figured very prominently in Sir Walter Scott's books. Finally, we have Dr. Michael Newton, a man who approaches the study of Scottish history through its own language, the Gaelic language, and that is a remarkable perspective that he could bring to this discussion. And finally, we have the author of the fabulous and enormously influential Outlander series, Diana Gabaldon, is joining us from Santa Fe, New Mexico today. And so we've got the crew assembled here to really look at 200 years of historical fiction in Scotland and having to do with the Scottish Highlands. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panel moderator today, Dr. Carolyn McCracken-Flesher, and please enjoy a wonderful panel.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you. And we have one other additional person on the panel, of course, and that is Lauren Perry, because this is the beginning of a discussion that's going to span 2 book group sessions, and the second one is going to focus entirely on the Outlander novels. So we're building the ground, setting the groundwork today for further discussions later. What I'd like to ask the panel to begin with is to sort of help me in giving a sense of Waverley and the importance of that book. We know that Scott was already a poet, he was already a lawyer, this was sort of his 3rd career, and he said, he actually wrote that poetry and being known as a poet somehow undermined his legal business, and so he was writing anonymously when he turned to the novels in 1814. And by this time he's already quite well known then, and he writes a novel that begins as his 60 years since. And then, of course, Diana is a scientist. She's already had 2 careers at least before she started to write. Right? So she's been a scientist. And, yeah, and I think we call it a 2nd career in writing scripts for Scrooge McDuck as well, right? So it's a good tradition of 2 careers and then turning to the novel. So let's think a little bit about what is the story, for instance, of Waverley that became so compelling that it's considered a superstore notions highland. And just in general, about the plot of Waverley and the interest of the story. And that's a question for everybody to jump right in.
Okay. Well, I could start with some comments.
Yeah, I'm actually going to let Diana speak first because we're having difficulty with her feed. So Diana, why don't you talk to begin with?
Okay. Well, it's actually hear myself, which is very distracting, so I'll try not to. Waverley is based very much on the notion of romanticism as romanticism, and that's tied very much to the Highlands and to Jacobite risings. There's something more romantic than the Zoom's cause, which the Jacobite risings really were. And so the minute you enter that territory, raw material at hand, thanks and becoming very familiar with the Highlands as it was. You can't mention the Jacobites without wading knee deep in romanticism, and he makes this point himself, not only in his notes on the book in his introduction, but in those very long expository 3 chapters. So he goes on and on and on and on and on and Waverley and how he, waited through all of this, sort of romantic tales of this, that, and the other, which obviously decomposed in all of Jacobites and the circumstance that it's for, so to speak. But yeah, I'd say that's pretty much what he said about in this book. It's just the long-term appeal of romanticism interacting with the world.
So I'm hoping that people could hear that well, because we're listening to Diana by phone as well as seeing her on the screen. She was talking about how Scott's sort of knee-deep in romanticism and history, and how effective all that, the conflict, and gives tremendous raw material for a book. Once you get through that long introduction, which I suspect we're going to be talking about at some point, where Waverley is reading, just as Dr. Johnson said, reading was for the young, the ignorant, and the idle, and he's reading novels, and he's a very young, ignorant, and idle reader for quite a few chapters as they begin. Would the rest of you agree? What are the things that how would you characterize Waverley sort of overall in terms of its influence?
Well, if I would offer some comments, if I can, about the social and cultural context, which is that you have the penetration of multiple communities. Remember that the Highlands are a Gaelic-speaking area, and it has a very distinctive culture and society, and it's really been very distinguished, very distinct from the rest of Scotland as well as Britain to this point. You already have the popularization of the poetry attributed to Ossian by James Macpherson in the 1760s, which brings greater awareness to this kind of othered people who are kind of demonized in a lot of ways for generations. And so Scott is trying to draw on this long history of exoticization of the Highlanders and act as a sort of cultural broker between Highlands and Lowlands. He himself, of course, doesn't speak Gaelic. He needs to rely upon people who are Gaelic speakers to act as intermediaries to give him material that he can incorporate into his books. But he is working in the aftermath of the destruction of a culture, and what's really, I think, important and novel about what he does is he is talking about the collision of two worlds, and that's why the model that he sets up in his historical fiction is taken up by other writers, such as James Fenimore Cooper in the US, and later in India by writers in India, because they're seeing the destruction of traditional cultures by imperial cultures. And this is really a recurring incident throughout the 19th century, and that's, I think, one of the things that makes his work so important in historical terms. So we have the interpenetration of these two different groups, and I want to emphasize, you have to look at the Highlands and Lowlands as being two different ethnic groups, two different nations in the old sense of the word.
Yeah, it looked like you had something you wanted to add there when we were talking about the multiple communities and the aftermath.
I'm sorry, we couldn't hear Diana at this end. I'm very sorry about that. So I'm not quite sure what she said, but we heard Michael loud and clear there. I mean, to me, reading the book again in the last week, looking at it again, it's really, you've got everything there that people expect of Scotland. You've got chiefs, you've got tartan, you've got copious amounts of whiskey, you've got a battle of Preston pans. These are all things that helped give Scotland this certain romance and this allure that people like to think that Scotland is like that. It's all part of the Highlandism thing. And of course, Walter Scott, of course, is the man who put the Scot in Scotland. So people would expect no less of him. You know, he basically decided that Scotland was going to be tartan and Scotland was going to be set in a glen. And this is very much what he's done in this novel, Waverley. I mean, having said that, it's a good read. I think the first few chapters are a little bit slow to get through, but once you get through those, it's a good historical read. You know, why let the facts spoil a good story? I think that was part of Walter Scott's whole ethos, really. This was a Scotland that he imagined and wanted to show to the world.
I'm going to move on a little bit because we're approaching subjects that I know are going to yield rich discussion in this context. And I want to talk about that issue of how we have a particular idea of Scotland, because it's striking in both Outlander, by the title, and in Waverley, that in both cases, someone comes into Scotland from the outside. I mean, when people approach Waverley for the first time, they tend to assume that Waverley's going to be a Scot, but of course he's not, right? He is this young English guy who has been lounging around, you know, the family estate and just hanging out and reading. And so he's English, he's young, he's impressionable, and I'm wondering what's so attractive to readers, and I'm thinking about those early readers too, who didn't quite yet know what Scotland was because they hadn't had Scots Scotland, right? So what's so attractive to readers about a stranger in the landscape? And that's a power that Diana deploys very much in Outlander with Claire Randall, the importance of the stranger entering the landscape.
More or less the best way of explicating a strange landscape to a novel's readers without having to do what Sir Walter did and go into long expository and digressing sections describing, you know, how this works and how that works and so forth. As you can see, as you get deeper into Waverley, it's doing that, but Waverley gets into the Highlands because Waverley is experiencing the Scots, and therefore, you know, the old thing about show, don't tell. Getting to see things actually in operation. The most effective way of doing that is through the eyes of the stranger. The readers are strangers too, so they feel an instant sense of empathy with the narrator who is fish out of water, and that gives you a chance to explain maybe obscure bits of the landscape or the dialect or the custom or whatever, because your fish out of water can't be expected to know that, and therefore they have an excuse for saying, oh my God, what's that? And whereas the local inhabitants would never even notice that, whatever it was. So yes, it's just really interesting literary device and this advantage of what anyone would do in a strange situation, just look around and ask questions.
So Diana just was pointing out that having that stranger's eye allows you to discover the landscape in a different way. It actually removes that difficulty of long expository passages. You don't need them quite so much whenever you're following someone. And certainly, do you have the sense that the novel speeds up a lot once Waverley actually gets to the north and is deeply embroiled in what's happening? Kelly, what do you think?
No, I think we're all strangers, aren't we? When you pick up a book and you're reading through it, it's an adventure. I think we can all identify with Waverley as he grows, and we become Waverley as you're reading. I don't think it'd be as significant as work if we had it told in the third person, so to speak. I know it is in the third person, but you can identify with Waverley himself. He becomes Scottish, and in a way, he wears the Highland attire. You look at Scottish festivals, you'll see the people coming up to the tent and wanting to know who their clan is. What tartan do I have? They want to become part of something, and I think it's something that was created by Scott. You try to tell them otherwise, and they'll argue with you. So I think his perspective really drew us into our cultural experience of Scott today in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. So that being enswathed in the landscape and the outfit makes a lot of difference.
It's men in kilts. It's men in kilts. Let's face it. Yeah.
Men in kilts. I'm struck by how well, of course, there's no option, lacking the benefit of powered flight. Waverley has to enter Scotland in stages, right? He heads north from England. He goes first to his regiment. He goes then to Perth. He goes to Tullyveolan, the Baron Bradward's house, and then he goes on up into the Highlands. And I'm wondering, Malcolm, since you're the landscape person, how good a sense does Scott give of the landscape? And what is the sort of visual sense of Waverley in that respect? Is it an accurate sense? Is it a romantic sense? Is that a landscape we could go look for now?
Well, I think Scott gives a very good depiction of the landscape. I mean, he is very good at saying what it is like to walk across rough ground, across peat hags, and the descriptions of that in Waverley. He himself, of course, did venture into the Highlands, and he, I think only as far as the Trossachs, from which he got the inspiration for Rob Roy, well, part of the inspiration. So I think it's a good depiction, and the idea of, well, it's a complicated issue, wild landscapes with wild clans is a, you know, it's just a very good combination from a presentational point of view if you're writing a book. And we're talking about an Outlander. Scott himself was an Outlander in the case of the Highlands. He wasn't a Highlander, he was a borderer. And he is trying to depict, as Michael has said, a culture, a community, a region that he's just not part of. Although he makes a jolly good job of it, and he actually puts that community and that culture well and truly on the map. And part of that, of doing that, is his descriptions of the landscape, much of which you can see today, no doubt about it. You go up to the Cairngorms, you'll get that feel of wilderness, north of Scotland, even parts of Perthshire. If you go to the old McGregor country, Glengyle and over the hills into the Balquhidder Glen, it's wild as hell, and it's all there. So he does a good job, I think.
He also, I'm thinking about someone like Oscar Wilde has a character say that nobody really saw a sunset until after the Impressionists, right? The Impressionists taught us how to see something, that the thing was always there, the experience was always available, but we didn't see it in the same way. Does he change the eye that we bring to the landscape? I think you're absolutely right that you can actually feel the discomfort of slogging through the territory often when Waverley's carried along, by the clansmen, he's bumping into things. But there's also that sort of crafting the landscape in a particular way when he approaches Donald Bingley's cave, for instance, and you see the light out across the water and things like that. What do people think about that sense of landscape? Scott also worked a lot with his illustrators, too.
I think it's painted an ideal picture. You can, like you say, coming up to the cave, you're there, you can see it. But what Malcolm was talking about in the landscape, aren't the people themselves part of the landscape? You have the scene where Waverley is first coming to visit Redwarden and describing the village. How do you distinguish the dirty-faced children from the village itself? They're one and the same. The hunting scene, you have the Highlanders being part of the land, so they are the land. You have the herd coming in, and I'm reading this and thinking, again, and it's the Highlanders and the deer are one and the same. And then when the hunting party disperses, you see some going to the Highlands and some going down the glen. And the people themselves in that picture are part of the landscape. They are the landscape itself. I think it's beautiful.
We do have a transition into a period of the sublime, this notion of wild landscapes and wild nature being treasured and valued for their own sake. This is kind of a new idea entering literature, and it's very different from the way that the Highlanders who lived there felt about the land. They didn't say, oh, we're wild people in a wild land, right? This is the way that Anglophones thought about the Highlands, and so he's kind of catering to his audience. He knows who his audience is because he's been trained in the same literary tradition. But I just want to make the point, this is very different from how Highlanders saw the landscape. This is simply their home. You have people like Daniel Defoe and Edmund Burt earlier in the 1700s talking about how horrifying the Highlands were because of these wild lands and wild people. But that's an external perception, right? That's not the way that Gales described their own experience of what home meant to them and their own attachment to land. So Again, just to represent these two different communities with their two different vantage points.
You know, that's very interesting, Michael, and I think what strikes me is the extent to which you have communities, the Highlands and the borders, and then even England, just to the south, that are very close to each other, but when the Highlands in Scotland were portrayed as being so incredibly exotic. It's right there out your front door or your back door, and yet the view from the south was that it was this remarkably exotic place. It was wild, filled with wild barbaric savages and all of these things. And so I think that Michael's point is extremely well taken. That is an overlay. That's a patina coming from an outsider or an outlander perspective, when really there is something that we still have yet to learn about, which is how did the Highlanders perceive their own culture? I don't think Scott really was able to articulate that. I think he was reflecting what he saw and how he perceived it, but there is a different view of that culture.
It's worth us remembering right now too that Scott worked with lots of illustrators on those books, and he often would point out, really you should be sketching this, you should be sketching that. If any of you have had the opportunity to see the movie about Turner, Turner was one of the few that Scott worked with a number of times, but he found Turner quite difficult to work with, and maybe if you've seen the movie, you would understand that difficulty. Someone was trying to add a little bit there in thoughts.
Yes, it was me. I was just going to echo really what Michael was saying, the romance and the reality, because we've almost built these Highlanders up. Scott's almost built these Highlanders up as noble savages, but that life, Michael was saying, was incredibly hard then in those days for the people who lived in these hills and glens. I'll give you an example. There was one French writer who arrived there and wrote about it, his experiences, and he reached an inn, he stayed overnight at an inn where all the family had scabies and terrible diseases, and he actually wrote nothing would give you more of an idea of the poverty that exists here. I mean, these were really, they were backward people, and a lot of them were near savages, and so, what Walter Scott has done is give them some sort of, he's made them into like noble savages. And don't forget, this was the age of the Romantic movement, when people were looking for beauty in untutored things. Michael, you're laughing. Do you not agree with me, or do you?
I totally disagree. Who are the savages, really? I mean, that's the way that people had lived for thousands of years. How people still live in many other places now. I mean, you're projecting an Anglophone value system and calling these are primitive people, these are savages. Of course he is experiencing a clash of cultures, but you are projecting an Anglophone value system by saying that.
Well, it's interesting to think about this in terms of what's happening in Scotland at the time, and I know Diana's dying to get into this, so I'm going to let her in just a second. But it is interesting to think about the 1745 happening at the same time as Edinburgh is thinking of itself as very enlightened and focused on a particular kind of culture and so on. And you have, just a little bit later, on the one hand, you have the French writer coming and ignoring poverty, but you have Dr. Johnson who comes and you can see very little else just a few years later, and deliberately sort of doesn't spend much time in somewhere like Edinburgh at all because he doesn't want to see that possibility. And so there's a selective vision going on, isn't there? And Diana, what were you hoping to add in here?
Yeah, I was going to say that what Walter is doing is exactly what Michael says. He's projecting his own cultural values, which are actually not uncommonly shared these days. I am remembering a book tour which went to Edinburgh under the care of a publicist from my UK publishing house, who was, of course, based in London. And I remember we stopped at an ATM so she could get some cash for gas, and she put in her card, and it spit out several Bank of Scotland notes. And she stood there and stared at it for a moment, and turned the bill over to look at it, and she said, I never actually handled for it, not aiming for it. At least they legitimate UK currency. He said, I never did, out of England, you know, and we're standing on the main street of the modern Edinburgh of the new town and so forth, and she was figuring out, you know, obviously, feeling very out of her element that she was surrounded by these strangers, possibly impossible and scared. Because there's myself, an American, standing there thinking, watching very crazy, but, you know, it's a very deeply ingrained notion. And it is very reasonable, too, if you and your culture have spent hundreds of years with the same idea of another culture. It's very difficult to eradicate that, taken by individual personal experience. And Walter wasn't actually intending to eradicate that. He was really reinforcing what his readers thought. Now, I think he was very sympathetic to the Highland culture and was depicting it as accurately as he could, but there's still always going to be that's not the categorization or condescension, but the sort of like John wonder at the way these people behave. And that kind of goes along with any sort of fish out of water story. If you're inserted into a foreign culture, whether you consider it to be more elevated than your own or less, you're still going to feel very uncomfortable until you've made an internal accommodation with it. And something that a lot of people have not done or don't have the opportunity to do. But, you know, you have to approach it as a novelist as well as a cultural anthropologist. Sir Walter wasn't burdened with the last years of doing it as a novelist.
But it is interesting that sometimes Scott is thought of as sort of an early part of that anthropological tradition. But I love your story about the banknotes and how people feel sort of out of step with the culture, right? Because, of course, if you get a banknote in Scotland, it's quite likely it has Walter Scott on it. But that's a whole other big story. I want to move on a little bit, thinking about all of your experiences. And when we read, we imagine places. And I'm always fascinated by how people imagine, particularly the houses that Waverley visits, because I realize in my own reading, for instance, that whenever I think about him going to Tullyveolan, or however it's appropriately pronounced, I always think of him as somehow at Traquair Castle. And of course, that's in the Lowlands. So I'm curious to know, what if you were directing one of our listeners, one of our Google Hangout club, to think about where they might visit to get a sense of the houses and castles that Waverley would have visited. So Tullyveolan, Fergus McIver's castle. Where would you see, of all the places that you've visited, as the ones you think that you carry in your minds when you're reading the novel?
Well, I have a very experience of the Highlands because I've been there repeatedly in different places and times. So my original impressions were done from research, and I used, for instance, Castle Leoch is a traditional Scottish fortified powerhouse. What's interesting about that is that I pulled the name without from thin air, and I described this according to the pattern from my research. Well, several years later, after my books had begun being visible, I stopped at a Highlands Games at the Clan Mackenzie booth just to, give them my regards. They were very excited, and they said, "Oh, we're so thrilled, when we saw that you had used our castle." And I said, "Oh," and this was the first time I learned that the Clan Mackenzie in Stafford is actually called Castle Loud, W-O-D. So it's pure coincidence that I had used the name so close to it. What was more coincidental, they turned the page of their scrapbook and showed me a photograph of the castle, which is a very traditional Scottish fortified tower house, and looks exactly like what I had described. But I described it not from the particular, but from the general pattern that I saw in research. And I tend to do that with most of the dwellings. I research a number of them. If I've been in one, start with like Leonard farmhouse on the edge of Lochmoor, that's very specific structure. And I described it as it might have been in the 18th century at the time of the battle. But it is a very specific house. I didn't describe it specifically. Other places, I have to try to look for exemplars. Hugh Allison, one of the tour directors who does tours based on Outlander, sent me a picture of Ord House, which is near Viewing, and it's a hotel at the moment, but it is an old Scottish manor house. And he said, "I'm looking for some place that might resemble Valley Rock." So I went to their website, had a look, and I think it was very close, as a matter of fact. Now, when the TV people started looking for locations and so forth, they were using my books as a source. They also have a consulting historian, but I was also helping them with things like this. But they chose Dune Castle as their exemplar of Castle Leon. and it's not bad. It's a little more castle-like than your traditional Scottish tower house. I think that's what it is. And for Wandering Scots, they chose a place which is actually called Bedhouse Castle, but it is more or less a large manor house. It's not quite as close to what I described in the book, or probably what Wandering Scots actually has been. Bedhouse Castle was built in 1500, and they had to cover up the date on the lintel for it.
So there's a whole set of houses, and it sounds like we're thinking of types of houses, what Diana was saying, that square towers and baronial houses and so on. And so I'm curious, what about other possibilities of houses that might work in when you're imagining Scott and Waverley?
There are a number of large manor houses that I visited in Argyllshire particularly, and I was thinking of that, mainly in terms of Toledo and for the castles. That is actually Hugh's castle that he's describing. I did there, so I just recognize that immediately. Likewise, Holyrood Palace, I did that.
Sure.
So that's very clear in my mind.
So we can actually go to some of the locations of Waverley very specifically, right, to Stirling, to Holyrood. I'm wondering, Michael, or Malcolm and Michael and Fiona, do you have places that you think of in terms of this book?
Well, I think that the Baron's Castle in Waverley is based on Grantully Castle in Perthshire, which is a vast turreted place, still lived in by a family today, the Stuart Fotheringhams. I'm not sure, is it open to the public? I don't know whether it's open to the public, but it is. It's quite baronial, and it's called turrety bits, etc. But as far as the chief goes, I would imagine, would a chief live in something a little more basic, not quite as grand as that?
Well, it would depend, I think, on the chief and what his heritage was. I mean, there were chiefs that obviously did live in castles of sorts, and then chiefs who did not. I mean, I'm thinking about the best representation, what it might have been like. One of the routes up into the Cairngorms from Braemar, I think it is, or Ballater up to Tomontoul, and you pass a number of very isolated castles like Craigiebar. There's another couple, and it's very open, wild landscape, and that gives an idea of what it might have been like in those days. There were very few villages. Of course, there were villages, but this wild open land from Ballater up to Tomontoul is a very good route, with castles dotted around, gives a feel for the landscape and the sort of castle-type environment if you go on that route.
So that route from Ballater up through Tomontoul, and just keep your eyes open, you'll see places that,
Yes.
Yes.
I think one thing that, Malcolm, that you just, when you started your description there of that place, you noted that whether the chief lived in a castle or in something more modest depended on the clan and the chief and the time and what was going on. And I think, again, that sort of goes back to the fact that what we were truly dealing with in the Highlands was it was a civilization, a diverse culture that had a life of its own, and we should maybe try to avoid a monolithic idea of what the Highlands were at that time or are today. It was very diverse, and you can't just draw one picture and say that's the Highlands.
Yeah, the different chieftains had different economic potentials, as it were. But it is important to realize that the most important form of capital to Highlanders were people, social capital. There's a common anecdote in Gaelic about a Scottish chieftain who went down to visit somebody in London who was bragging about his wonderful candelabra. It was silver, it was very expensive, and he'd spent all this money on it. And the chieftain, this was actually MacDonald Kepach, said, come visit me sometime in my residence, and I'll show you a candelabra which is far more impressive, much more valuable than yours. And so about a year later, the Englishman came up and visited him, and they have this spread of the salmon and the deer, the venison, and so on. from the estate, and the Englishman says, you know, well, where's this candelabra? This is not a very impressive residence that you have compared to mine. And he said, okay, my candelabra is coming in now. And in comes his set of retainers, 9 warriors, each holding a candle and a sword. And so the Englishman had to say, yes, this is much more impressive than mine. And the story is important in showing that is the Gallic value system. It is not on things, the materialistic world that, you know, the English Empire was expanding and promoting as the value system. And of course, once Highland chieftains became further integrated into the British mainstream in the 17th century, their spending on things like their residences were one of the things that made them so indebted that they had to get rid of their people. So just to give you, again, this to reiterate what Susan said, this is a different civilization with a different value system.
Does Scott begin to give any of us a sense of that, where you know, his Fergus is a complicated fellow, right? This is the friend that Waverley makes as he travels north. Waverley doesn't always know what's going on around him. He travels to Fergus's home, and Fergus has lots of people around him. But he chooses moments when we're going to see them, when we're not. And he is very much politically on the make at the time, Fergus, right? That he has particular ambitions as part of the rebellion, and when they don't come through, I suspect that there's no point in worrying about spoilers in a 200-year-old. But it doesn't. He is not happy when things don't work out for him as he expected. So he's always sort of negotiating his position in relationship to his people at home and to the court. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about him as a specific character and inspirations for him, because there is a contemporary character, contemporary of Walter Scott's, and I think some of you may have looked and had a chance to see Osborne's book on Alistair Ralston MacDonald of Glengarry, right? And how he thought that he was a model for Fergus, but there's another argument that says he figured out how to be that kind of clan chief by being allied with Scott. So I'm curious to know what people think about Fergus.
Well, I go back to my, it's a quote from Linda Colley, the historian, that Walter Scott romanticised and sanitised the glens, and he certainly did something with Glengarry, because, you know, Fergus in the book, you like him hugely, you know, you're really sad when he's going to be executed at the end. But if he is based on Glengarry, the 15th chief of Glengarry, I mean, Glengarry was haughty, he was flamboyant, he cleared people from his land to put sheep on, he increased the rents, he got the evictions, he was even tried for murder, but he was acquitted of that. And in the Raeburn painting of him, you see this man who seems like an honourable, proud father of his clan, and really nothing could have been more opposite. He set up the Society of True Highlanders in 1815. He was really playing the role of clan chief, or how he thought a clan chief should be. But you know, he was trying to maintain this importance of being a clan chief at a time when the relevance of a clan chief had gone. Because clan chiefs no longer looked after some clan chiefs no longer looked after their people. They were clearing them from their land. Glengarry died absolutely in debt. I think he owed about £38,000 when he died. And he was a thoroughly unsavoury character. And yet Walter Scott thought the world of him. He thought he was a wonderful man. He admired Glengarry, but interestingly, Robbie Burns called Glengarry a cold-hearted tyrant. At the end of the day, Glengarry strutted about as a leader of this tartan cult, and it gave him a great cachet and an influence, but not a very nice man indeed.
Maybe part of the problem is Scott picks up the story of the clan chief at the later end of the clan tradition, at a time when, at the time really, where these ancient Celtic and Gaelic traditions were running headlong into Enlightenment ideas and thoughts, and we don't really see what preceded the Glengarry caricature, if you will. So I don't sense that in reading Waverley that we get much of an idea of what the clan system was like before this period.
Do you have other thoughts about that, or are we moving on?
No, I mean, I think you're right, Sue. We don't get an impression at all. And I think part of the problem is that the Jacobite uprisings are a great subject, and that's where this history sort of seems to begin and sort of end amongst the clans, amongst the writers. It's got everything you want. So maybe these writers, you know, it would have been extremely helpful to have suggested within Waverley where actually Fergus MacIver came from, who were his antecedents, and what did they all get up to? Because prior to the Jacobite uprising, of course, many clans were fighting each other, and then the Jacobite scenario or situation changed, and they were all of a sudden they were on the same side fighting the Hanoverians for the Jacobite cause. Well, for the Stuart cause. So, I suppose as a writer, why would you bring in the earlier aspects of clan life? Maybe they didn't really know too much about it, or Scott just couldn't get in there and find out about it. I don't know.
But MacIver is very much...
Except for the fact that really, MacIver really is a character that is somewhat torn between two worlds, because sometimes you see Scott describing him as almost more of a Dougal Mackenzie sort of, not more of an outlaw, as opposed to the parlor, perfectly dressed, sort of regimental Glengarry type. And so maybe Scott does have him being drawn between two worlds, between the older Gaelic world and then into the more British world.
Yeah, again, I think this relates to the audience. Scott is writing for an Anglophone audience who know nothing about the Highlands except for where Highlanders enter the stage of these civil wars and the Jacobite cause. So why would readers at his time be interested in a purely Gaelic world where you have rivalries between various clans? It just wasn't interested in that, because that was far beyond the knowledge of Anglophones at that time period.
He does mention, doesn't he, in an interesting little aside, that the title that Fergus has is by no means secure, right? That there's been some contention previously, and of course the same was true of Glengarry. So there's that sense of that things are not as straightforward as they may appear, and that there's a certain element of performance in this book for Fergus and taking on the role of chieftain. I want to actually send us a slightly different direction now. Maybe we can work your comment in just a second, Kelly. But in terms of what kind of a performance Waverley is, there were readers at the time, because of course it was published anonymously, and there were readers who were trying desperately to figure out who had written this book. And there was a strong argument at that time, and then it comes back later in the 19th century. This book was written by an American. It's not a sustainable argument, by the way. I mean, we know it was not written by anybody other than Scott. But they thought it was written by an American, and I was just reading one of those critiques recently, and the argument was partly about what we would now call the sort of uneven development of places, and how entranced this book was with a Highland culture, and how it used words that no British person would use, like wigwam, like talking about Highlanders perceiving an Indian file. And I'm wondering what you think is going on where Scott is using those kinds of words. The argument was, by the way, that Scott had a brother who had gone to North America, and that probably it was the brother was actually writing, not Scott, but that is not in fact the case. So the question's really about that sense of a different culture and how it lines up with the American, and what a reader's experience might have been at that time, encountering this kind of book.
Can I speak?
Please do.
Okay. Yeah. As for Walter Scott's terms like wigwam and Indian file and so forth, he said himself in his introduction to the book that he read, essentially adventure romance novels, or what was classically called romance at that time, which was what we would now call adventure, and so forth. And he undoubtedly read, I think it was earlier in the James Junior book, but he was reading, American authors as well as others. He would plainly have picked up words like wigwam and Indian file, because that sort of story, about the Native Americans of the time was so exotic that it was very interesting to people. Now, I don't know what specifically he may have read that led him to that, but I would be willing to bet that's where he got it, was from his own reading. And the thing is that even if you are being very careful, it's almost impossible not to allow some of yourself as a novelist to see through on the page. In fact, I very often have readers say, they write to me and they say, for the familiarity of using your first name, which they kind of have to, this Gabaldon is so ridiculous. But they say that I feel I know you, having read all your books. And I say, well, you do know me. You know me probably as well as anybody does, because everything the writer is right there on the page. You just have to learn to see it. And so I'm not at all surprised that this is there. Now, in my own books, I do make a great effort to adopt the viewpoint of whoever I'm writing from, so to speak, and consequently, I've been very flattered that by and large, most Scottish readers who write to me think I am Scottish, unless they've been otherwise informed, in which they're astounded, that I both got it right. I'm very, very flattered hearing that, and that it is, a substantial effort, and I'm sure there are still Americanisms. There's only one that I know of. Evidently, gotten is an Americanism, and to be got. And it is, however, back formation to Elizabethan English, so in fact, the American is the older form, and that's what I would automatically use, because I had to pick that up in my careful bilingual reading of British English. Then I'm very careful not to use gotten when I'm writing it.
You could start a campaign for gotten, though, with similar words.
I like to use the word monger as much as possible in compounds.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. What else do we want to talk about? We're running toward the end of our time here, although we can extend a little bit. Actually, I'd like to talk a little bit more. Thinking about the words, and Diana was saying authors are kind of like sponges, and everything. You pick up, and certainly Scott's loved words, and you find him talking to the masons who are working on his new house to try to come up with great words. But the Gallic background of Waverley as that title character goes further into the Highlands, we don't hear any Gaelic, but we hear him responding to Gaelic. And I wondered, Michael, and all of our readers, what you thought about that. Do you get that sense of strangeness? What would he have heard? Why is he, on the one hand, sure that he sort of understands, but clearly not? So what do you think about that issue of language?
Well, one thing, again, talking about introduction of terms and words and penetration of communities, Scott really was responsible for making Anglophones, both in the Lowlands and in England, aware of a number of terms in Gaelic and popularizing them. I think words like Coronach and slogan and several other words that are based on Gaelic words really entered common English usage through Scott's book. And in fact, I was just reading an article this morning that said that, why is it that there's only one lake in Scotland, the Lake of Menteith? Well, actually, it has a Gaelic name, which is Loch Inchmahomach, and that is the term that was used by for a long time, but it's really through Scott's work that he picks up on a book that calls it the Lake of Menteith in his work, and it's because of everybody reading Scott that it becomes called a lake rather than a loch. So it shows how much literature can affect linguistic usage. But again, the Highlands was a completely Gaelic-speaking area during Scott's time, and anybody, especially before, say during the 45, who entered the Highlands was entering a zone in which English, would have been spoken by the elite, but very few. And so that sense of strangeness and exoticness, language was a part of that, and that, I think, is effectively conveyed by Scott. Again, he was working through intermediaries to get a number of terms and names and so on that he tries to give anglicized forms for. And if you're a Gaelic reader or speaker, as I am, they seem kind of odd, but he's trying to act as an intermediary for people who, for whom Gaelic was a foreign language.
You know, what we've really been talking about here is not only in language and how what Michael said is, you know, literature, especially Scots literature, and the impact that it has had now for 2 centuries, has, I think, to a large degree defined the modern perception, the diaspora's modern perception of what Scotland is. And you see, you know, as Kelly said earlier, you see it at the Highland Games on Clan Row. Everyone has this very regimental, Victorian outfit. That is the outfit. You've got the filly bag. You don't have the great kilt. You've got a very militaristic sort of countenance, and that is how the diaspora has sort of come to perform its ethnicity. But now, and maybe this is leading into a little bit of next week's discussion, we have a new influence coming onto the scene that's been with us for a few decades, and that's the Outlander influence. And I think that we're now seeing a different portrayal of what the Highlands were, and it might be a very good thing, because not only did Scott define the linguistics, but he really defined the entire perception of what the Highlands were, and he defined it on, as we've been talking, a British or Anglophone perception. And I wonder if Outlander is going to give us the opportunity to really dig behind that a little bit and tell the story of what happened before Fergus MacIvor and how all of that really was gelling in the Highlands, and so that we can understand. That would enable us to understand Waverley, I think, even a little bit more.
And I'm going to invite us to follow on your line of thinking and ponder what was happening beside Fergus and Waverley, right? The sort of the less developed, unspoken. And I'm very curious what you all think about the role of women in the book. So that what was the role of women in Highlandism and in history? This is, I guess, going to ask Fiona most of all, and Diana, because Diana sends Claire Randall to Scotland, to the Highlands, as a strong woman, right? A woman with a career who's sort of immediately active in the landscape. And I'm curious to think about, we've got Flora, we've got Rose, interestingly divided by their names, you know, the wild and the cultivated, or the more civilizing cultivated Rose. And how that lines up with the realities of the time, or whether those also are romantic perceptions somehow.
Well, Flora, I imagine, is a symbol of the mythic attraction of the Highlands. But I'm going to quote David McCrone here, a writer, and he says, the image of tartanry is a very male, military one. The clothes that so define a Scotsman, or a Scot, the kilt, is worn by a man. And if you think about it, apart from Mary Queen of Scots or the lovely Flora MacDonald, how many women stand in the same Hall of Fame as Robert the Bruce, Bonnie Prince Charlie, William Wallace, Scott, Burns, or even the simple Highland soldier? And another point here, that other countries, or some other countries, have women to represent them. For example, France has Marianne. England has Britannia, modelled on the Duchess of Richmond. Scotland has come to be represented by a kilted man. The Scottish dreamscape, as David Hess says, is male. Now, having said that, women have done their bit to promote Highlandism. I'm thinking of women travel writers like Dorothy Wordsworth, who came to the Highlands and wrote about it. I'm thinking of Anne McVicar and her letters from the mountains. I'm thinking of people like Lady Carolina Nairn, who wrote Jacobite poetry, again eulogising Bonnie Prince Charlie, will you know, come back again, and Charlie is my darling. And then, of course, the one person who did more than anybody else, I think, for Highlandism, apart from Walter Scott, and that was Victoria, Queen Victoria, in the Victorian age. But so women have played a small role in promoting Highlandism during the 18th century and a much bigger one during the 19th century.
Is there a class issue involved also in thinking about this? Because I'm thinking about, I brought some books with me too. There's Rosalind K. Marshall's Virgins and Viragos, right? So on the one hand, to be represented a lot by Mary Queen of Scots, who's sort of famously, unfortunately, the failed monarch. But on the other hand, the women who got involved in battles over local law or what text is used in church, or overturning back the taxman, for instance. I mean, part of Scottish history is scattered with those stories too.
Well, yes, it is. You find quite a number of stories involving heroic or strong women and so forth, but there are the small local anecdotes that you wouldn't find normally in popular histories and so forth. As you said, or Tina said, a great deal of Scottish history is political and warfare and outward conflict. Speaking from a novelistic point of view, women's lives are not very interesting. In the case of the novel, the reason that Claire is a doctor and so forth is because I thought about it. I said, well, if I were in the 18th century, what sort of skills would I like to take with me? And I said, I think I'd like to be something in the medical line so I'd have a better chance of staying alive. But it occurred to me also that Claire as a healer would be acceptable in spite of her sex, because if you're bleeding to death, you don't care who's going to snatch it. So the gender is much less of a problem, but also it gave her the perfect excuse to go on the battlefield. And actually women went to battlefields. They were there. They often followed their men to battle and would rush onto the field, sometimes to help fight, sometimes to pick up the wounded and so forth. They were there. Which involves normally in the forefront of battle, and therefore they weren't written about. Because if you got a sword fight going on in front of your eyes, you are just not looking at the woman who's standing on the hillside, clutching her fist.
One way of thinking about,
We never hear about the women that died in the battles, now do we? The Battle of Flodden, we don't hear about the women at Harlow. We hear about maybe Molly Pitcher, from the American Revolution, but they're just, the women were there. I think that's a point. I would like to hear more about the women. That's why I kind of like Diana's approach, to bring the women to the forefront. When you talk about women that had a mark on our awareness of or impression of the romance of Scottishism, what about Lady Jane Scott and her roadmap, if you will? You take the high road, and I take the low road. That's a very significant writer in a period of time when men were those who were getting published.
Well, within Highland tradition itself, women had some of the most dominant voices in politics. So when you look at the Gaelic songs about the Jacobite risings, 1715 to 1745, perhaps a majority of the poems that were political propaganda about these battles were composed by women. So clearly women had the ability to influence men who made choices whether to go to battle or bring their retainers or their dependents into battle. But in terms of what's going on in the Highlands, you can think of things in terms of official institutional power and kind of invisible non-institutional power. So in institutional power, men really had the dominant roles and access to that power, and women had access via the men. However, when you look at the way that homes are run, quite often men go off to battle and somebody's got to run the house, right? So the women are at the house running the affairs while the husband is off to court in Edinburgh or London or battle, what have you, taking the cattle droves down to Falkirk. So women are there, but they're harder to see in the records unless you're looking at the Gaelic poetry and what people are talking about. And I think that the main reason that women drop out of the picture is because of the colonial context. That what often happens in societies that are tribal or whatever you want to call it is you have this kind of parity of institutional power and non-institutional power, but when that society becomes colonized, usually the colonizer has a very patriarchal and male-centered power structure, And that's what happens in the Highlands. So why is it that tartan is very male-dominated? It's because tartanism, as it was popularized certainly in the later 18th century and 19th century, it is about military power. So your landholders, they know that there's a lot of money to be made by selling their men into regiments and playing up this militaristic image. And there's no place for women in that. But again, going back to the Gallic cosmology, Gallic belief system, Gallic oral tradition, women have a very strong role to play in that. Some of the most powerful figures, like Cailleach Ver, these are female figures. But these things get repressed and they get inferiorized by the colonizing culture.
Sort of depends on who's telling the story, I think is exactly what Michael said. And have we really spoken yet about the fact that there was a Flora MacDonald, and also there was a Colonel Anne McIntosh, or that's what we call her now, with the Rout of Moy. So really, on the Gallic side, there were some extremely strong women that were there, but I didn't perceive Waverley to really pick up on that strong woman character. He's kind of left it out.
It is interesting, isn't it, that he has these two, sort of the dark and light heroine, to go back to a discussion that we used to have, 20, 30 years ago. And that Flora, however strong she is, what we see her actually do is get winged by a bullet during the celebrations. And
she was strong, but as an observer.
Yeah. Although Rose is pretty darn active behind the scenes, I think, as you get on in the novel, right?
Well, again, bear in mind the viewpoint that he's using. This is Waverley's story. And so he sees the women, he sees Rose and Flora as Waverley would have seen them, which is basically, oh, is this a candidate for my affections? He was not really concerned with, what they were doing. He might have been impressed by their manner or their organization or something like that. But mostly he was thinking, eating, meeny, mighty, mo, who do I want?
And Scott's pretty explicit about that.
There's one lady that we overlook in Waverley who had a significant impact on the story, and that's Madame Nosebag. I mean, she has the shortest, maybe less than 3 pages in the whole novel, and then she comes right back at the end, kind of seals the deal with the return of Red Warden's Cup. But, with just very few words, she's able to not only depict the character, but bring peril into Waverley's coach journey to London, and how easy it would be for him to be revealed. Frankly, she's one of my favorites. One of the shortest, but one of my favorites.
And of course, and I think another thing we might bear in mind as we're coming to a close shortly is that Scott is the one who's remembered for the historical novel and for really getting it going and being so successful that people start to head north in droves, and it drives up the carriage traffic to Loch Katrine and all the rest of it. But he's actually himself in a tradition of women writing historical novels that he knows about very well, and that's one of the things that he says in his postscript. He admired very much Maria Edgeworth, who was writing historical novels, or a sort of novel with history in it, and we'll talk about that in a moment, for Ireland. And Jane Porter had just written about the Scottish chiefs. So that there were other people out there writing, and there's a sort of conjunction of market and reading your audience right and so on that makes this the very compelling vision. But I want us to come to that issue of the history in the novel, and Diana took it head on at the very beginning. You said, this sort of history that we put in novels, and think about the historical sense in something like Waverley. How precise does history have to be in a novel that we call historical, or is that just our problem, and really we don't need to worry about it for the novel itself? Because I'm thinking about something like Waverley meets Prince Charles, so there's actually, there's a historical figure that shows up right in the middle, and they talk about girls.
Well, the guys talk about girls.
Of course they would. They're young men. That's why they're talking about girls.
Right.
No, it's a judgment call, always, in terms of how much history are you going to use and whose history are you going to use. because history is not actually what happened. It's what someone chose to write down. And it's more than what someone wrote it down. You're getting a lot of different viewpoints. You also have this reiteration of history in which one fairly popular viewpoint becomes the official viewpoint, and then it gets echoed down and down the years, which is why the American South, for instance, has always been very underrepresented in terms of historical discussion of the Civil War. It's because the North won, and therefore the North was running the publishing industry and the newspapers, and those were the viewpoints that became entrenched. If you go back as a historian and start looking at the time, you have to really dig to find what was being written in the smaller Scottish newspapers, the smaller Southern newspapers, but there's all the northern viewpoints right on display, and so that as time as he keeps getting promulgated. The same with any historical thing. You know, if you're looking at the many Jacobite views of Bonnie Prince Charlie, they weren't at all what he was really like. I used as my basis for him Susan McLean-Kybet's very excellent and scholarly book titled Bonnie Prince Charlie, where she went back and dug for 6 years into the Stuart papers. And she's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and her view of him is, based on really hard evidence. And so I used that as my basis. But, as a novelist, it's all a judgment call. Some people will bend history very much in the service of their story. I don't, but then I'm dealing with time travel to start with. And there's one point in Outlander where I told my husband I was somewhat upset because I really wanted to have a witchcraft trial to steal for the drama of it. But I said, I've done enough research here to know that the last witchcraft trial in Scotland was in 1722. And here I am in 1743. He looked at me for a minute.
I can tell you that
you have a book in which you start right off expecting your readers to forget that Stonehenge is a time machine, and you're worried that your witches are 20 years too late. That's the point. So yeah, I made that minor adjustment. I try always to document it when I do make very minor adjustments. I adjusted 1 year in Scottish prisoner because I needed Thomas Lally to be executed a year later than he actually was. but I documented that one too. As far as the historic stuff goes, it's as accurate as history is, which is variable.
There was a recent comment on the Wandering Scots Book Club on this, I think, where one of our administrators suggested that the more she reads history, the more she realizes that history is actually historical fiction, and you need to do exactly what Diana is talking about, is really get beyond that hagiographic kind of history that we have. Look, Fiona, it looks like you've got some comments there.
No, I was really interested in what you were saying, what Diana was saying there. As a journalist, of course, we always used to joke that never let the facts get in the way of a good story, and to a certain extent, Walter Scott has done that. And he has helped create a whole vision of Scotland, and 200 years on, people still see Scots in that way. Which has been great for tourism. It's been absolutely fantastic. But there are quite a few people in Scotland who actually, they say this isn't really our history. We weren't like that. We didn't all wear tartan, and we didn't all, we weren't all sort of had this Highland idyll, this Highland dream. So yes, it's a very interesting question about when you start rewriting history. Or, as you say, what is history? But when you start putting your own thoughts into it as well, into the melting pot, it's a bit of a case of be careful of what you start, because the end result could be a bit terrifying.
Do we need to have the details of the Battle of Preston Pan to move the novel, to move the story? To me, Preston Pan, it's the night before the battle when Colin Begg has an opportunity to snipe Colonel Gardner. And an old Highlander puts down his gun away and says, it's not his time. I see with the spirit upon him that he'll be dead tomorrow. And that's more of a battle experience than seeing the overall picture, the troop movements. I think it's very important that perhaps we walk away from what the historical account was and say, well, what was that experience for our character, for this one individual?
And I know that some of us have been watching the docudrama of Culloden, thinking about this discussion today. And I know, Malcolm, you have connections to the Battle of Preston Pans, and I'm wondering how those things come together in our understanding of the battle that we do get on the field, and why Scott actually doesn't really go to battle, although that's partly a Waverley problem, right? Because Waverley's never in the middle of something. He's always at the end.
Always happening around it, isn't it?
So, Malcolm, what do you think about the depiction of those circumstances around that particular battle?
Well, again, I think that it's pretty good, and perhaps not as detailed as what I've been able to pick up through aspects of MacGregor history, because the MacGregors were a former regiment in the 45, and they actually led the break-in into the Hanoverian army. And my direct ancestors were very heavily involved in the whole uprising, but in particular in respect of Preston Pans, they were right in the vanguard. And two of the brothers got quite badly injured. But the point was that the MacGregors led the break-in, and it was a sort of clan effort, and was allegedly greatly appreciated by Bonnie Prince Charlie, who gave them all breakfast, the whole clan, or the officers, not the whole clan, the officers, the officer contingent. So I think, I mean, Scott, he probably got it right, but there were other details of the battle that were to come out much later on in history.
And that's an interesting thing itself, isn't it? That things come to us at different paces. We talked about sort of Scotland being something that Scott was envisaging at a distance, according to particular moments at particular times, and even things that we consider historical themselves. We know more about them later than necessarily in the moment, and even when we know more about them later, there's a nice phrase in a book called The Ironous Cage, talking about history is the thing that happens when memory actually fades, right? So that you only get that possibility of codifying something and assuming that you've got the facts of it when, of course, you no longer have a memory of it. So there is that difficulty. I'm going to ask, I guess, begin to round our discussion up here, and think about if you were recommending Waverley to today's readers, which sort of we've been doing, what would you pick out as the thing that you would direct them to? I'm getting a sense, for instance, that we might say later on when Scott keeps writing, he starts to park a whole lot of things in his introductions, and they become a different kind of really very funny genre. He hasn't figured that out yet. So those opening chapters do kind of drag a little bit. I do remember thinking early in my career, really you should begin about chapter 5. But thinking around Waverley, people wanted to go back and get a sense of what this novel, which is kind of a formative novel in understanding the romantic historical sense of Scotland, what would you recommend that they should read? What do you think is the thing that you most enjoyed in the book?
If I was recommending Waverley to anybody, it depends on who's the person, what's their age. Or there's someone who's interested in the romance and the glamour of again, men wearing kilts. I'm an elder law trained. My clients are an aging population. Many of them have problems with diminished capacity. How do you maintain your capacity? By reading. I said, just read some Scott and try and work your way through some of his chapters. Try and diagram a sentence. It'll keep the mind active. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. So everybody does the thing.
So keep your mind active.
All right.
Read Scott. Yeah, get the work out.
You know, I think Scott, I don't know, this may be a really impolitic thing to say in this discussion, but I think when you read Scott, the best thing that you get out of it is a very good picture of Victorian Scotland. You don't get a good picture of that. That's what you're seeing. You're seeing that Scotland. And what that was, and for that, I think it's an absolutely excellent tool to learn about that area.
I would say that Scott is not inventing, this vision of tartan Scotland out of nothing, right? He's working with bits that have been there for a long time. I mean, the use of tartan to represent the Jacobite cause, for example, goes back to the 17th century. So whenever we're looking at history or reading an historical account, people are using some lens to interpret it. They're not necessarily inventing facts, but they are selecting what facts they think are the most important, and they're leaving out other things. So my recommendation to people would be, go back and look at the Gaelic literature produced by Highlanders about their own culture. And that's how you're going to understand what's going on in the Highlands the best way. Not through the projections of somebody from the outside. Go from the inside and look outwards. And there are really great collections of Gaelic poetry and oral narratives, which are older than Scott and which give a flavor of what that society was about.
Yes, I think, Michael, you put your finger on it there, giving a flavour of what the society is about. And I just go back, I think Scott is a wonderful writer, absolutely brilliant. I go back to MacIver, to the clan chief again in Waverley. And although I'm not certain that he very much resembles the wretched Glengarry, whom we discussed earlier, but certainly, reading the clan chief's exploits and seeing what his character is like, it's absolutely fantastic when you read that, because I'm thinking of another book now, Samuel Johnson, when he went to the Western Isles with James Boswell, and they wanted to meet a real live Scottish clan chief, and this was in the 1770s, late 1770s. And they met a guy called Sir Alexander MacDonald of Slate, and they hoped to find him roasting oxen whole and drinking whiskey by the gallon. And instead, this chief had been tamed into insignificance. He told the two men that he didn't carry any arms because they would rust in the wet weather. And then it got even worse because they met another chief, the MacLean, and he asked them to pray with him, to kneel down and pray with him. So when you meet a character like MacIver, he is exactly the sort of chief that, people reading Scott's novels wanted to read about. And I'm sure there were people like him around. What do you think, Malcolm, as a chief?
Yeah, well, what Johnson and Boswell should have done is gone to MacGregor land and met a real clan chief and said some about his rusty weapons. No, MacGregor would have carried a rusty weapon. Well, yeah, it's difficult. I mean, there were chiefs and there were chiefs, and there were. We've seen the image projected by Sir Walter Scott and Fergus MacIver. There were some extremely gallant and really, really tough chiefs, which was demonstrated at the Battle of Culloden. I think it was Cameron of Lochiel, who just went headlong into the enemy, and his clansmen carried him off the field of battle, and that was a real visible demonstration of leadership. It was a real do-or-die thing. So there were chiefs and there were chiefs, and there were chiefs that kept well out of any of this sort of thing.
And the fact that when MacIver is sentenced to death, and you get his clansmen offering themselves up in exchange for their chief, saying let him go, and we will die in his place, shows the sort of reverence that a chief would have been held in those days. The chief, we see in Waverley how he sits down and he eats with all his followers. You wouldn't get that with an English laird, I don't think. You'd have the lower people eating down in the kitchen, and the high ones up at the in the dining room table. So it's very interesting the way you get the impression of what sort of chief he is.
And, interestingly, we still have chiefs, and the case is still the same today. I mean, they are all individuals, and there is no one model template that they're all cut from. It's always been thus, and it probably always will be that way.
And we just saw the remarkable capacity to think on your feet that today's chief has.
Yes.
A fantastic return. I'm going to give the last word here to Lauren, if you can hear us, and to Diana to think about this question as we go toward our next reading group, which will be on the
February the 28th. Same time. It will be from 1:30 to 3 o'clock Eastern time. We've had a couple of technical glitches here. We'll get those worked out, but that'll be the date.
And by then, we'll be hoping to see Diana is bigger than a postage stamp, because right now that's all we can see.
That's all we get.
But Lauren and Diana, what thoughts do you have as you're going toward our next reading group?
I'll let Diana go first. Can you hear me? Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Yes. Diana, I'll let you speak first.
I'd like to see what in the next discussion.
Yes, why don't you tell us a little bit about that, what people might carry forward with them from Waverley as they're thinking about your writing.
Oh, well, bear in mind that I come to this as a novelist rather than a historian or a cultural anthropologist, even though we partake of all three. And so, you know, I'm concerned not only with what happens in Waverley, but how Sir Walter did it. You know, I appreciate his craft, you might say. And, you know, how did he put this together? If, referring back to the last question, if I were giving Waverley to someone, recommending it, I'd say, it's a great story. Read the introduction, because Sir Walter is really very funny and revelatory there. Then read the first chapter, and then skim the next 25. And start reading seriously when he meets Fergus.
There were so many questions that you all addressed that I'm over here writing all these notes furiously so I don't forget anything, that I think will transfer really well to a discussion of Diana's work, because whether it's on a much larger scale or now that we get to talk about something being written, you know, much more obviously present day, and then how readers now, we can talk about that probably more concretely than we could our discussion of Walter Scott. So there are a lot of similarities to talk about.
So we're looking forward to meeting the it's going to be definitely a much bigger audience next time as well, because as much as some of us love Walter Scott, we know it might be a rarefied interest these days, but we recommend him. Thank you all for participating. Thanks to all our panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And to our fearless technical administrator, who you may be able to see. He's been fantastic connecting people from all over, and we're very much with Diana, and we'll see Malcolm and Fiona, Lauren,
Michael.
Kelly again, Michael, and Sue, who was such a great participant, even though she wasn't going to say anything. He was our fearless leader for everything, and thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you and our expanded audience in just a few weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.